Our guest this evening, he grew up in one of Malaysia's most prominent political families, and he was also Asia's 50 most influential figures for the last decade. I'm Zahir Kelvinong Abdullah, and this is Money Matters. Welcome and thanks for joining us on TV3's flagship business program, Money Matters. We are joined by veteran banker Dato Sri Muhammad Nazir Tun Razak. Welcome to Money Matters.
Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you for your book, What's in the Name? Congratulations for this book.
Thank you.
And can I start off by asking you with regards to the evolution of Malaysia Incorporated, influence of the political economy on the corporate sector through the last few years?
Sure. I mean, I said in the book that Malaysia doesn't really have an economy. We have a political economy. And that's meant to underline the fact that there's a lot of politics in our economy, in our business sector. If you look at the evolution, we started off in the 70s with very much a state-led development model. And then in the early 80s, we had the Malaysia Inc. Mark I, I called. And that's when we had the sort of heavy industry program with Proton, HiCom, etc. being set up by the government. But also, at the same time, a strengthening of the role of private sector in general. That, however, stalled in the mid-1980s when the recession came. And then you basically came out of the recession with a new version of Malaysia Inc., which was a 2.0, which was really privatization, but also a corporate sector driven by businessmen anointed by the government. And that formula seemed to work well. But in reality, that is the formula that came crashing in the Asian financial crisis. Come out of that, I think we had what I call the Malaysia Inc. 3.0, which was really driven by the transformation of government-linked companies, as well as stronger governance of corporate Malaysia. So I think we had a golden era in the first decade of the 21st century, and then things started to go awry a bit with, the 1MDB debacle, and also the loosening of governance rules, and that I put down to the fact that politics came back into the business sector.
Right. So looking at the current situation, when you talk about reviving a pandemic-hit economy, so looking at the high COVID-19 vaccination rate, and now there are fewer cases, we're down to like 5,000 a day. And of course, the revocation of interstate travel and the reopening of businesses and various initiatives also from the 2022 budget. From your perspective, how well will all these things that are mentioned go in terms of the nation's path to economic recovery?
No, I think we will definitely bounce back. I think a combination of an expansionary budget plus the reopening of the economy, we will feel good because the economy will bounce. But the issue I have is that we, as a country, went into the pandemic with pre-existing conditions. We essentially had low FDI, fairly soft economic growth numbers. And of course, and everybody knows we have this problem of endemic corruption in the system, etc. So unfortunately, whilst I think we will bounce back, the question is, post-COVID, will we thrive again? We will have very strong growth numbers, and that's where I'm concerned.
Right. But looking at these growth numbers, we are going to compete with our ASEAN neighbours in terms of getting FDIs as well. So what do you think would make us stand out?
Well, I think the problem with Malaysia is that we are a small country. And in the old days, I remember when I was, marketing for investments in the 90s, there was no China to talk about. There was no India to talk about. And even, Indonesia and Vietnam were not really on the map as far as investment is concerned. Things have changed. As a smaller country, you really need to make your case very, very strongly. And unfortunately, we're not. Because when people look at Malaysia, unfortunately, at the moment, they associate it with some of the wrong things. So there needs to be a strong effort to basically repackage the Malaysian investment story.
What are the wrong things that they are looking at?
Well, I think we still have this, sense that Malaysia has too much politics in business. There's inadequate certainty for investors in terms of government policies, etc. And of course, there's this perception that our corruption levels are very high.
Right. So, looking at what the government has said, they want the private sector basically to return to playing a greater role, basically, in driving the country's economic growth. In your opinion, how can this be done, including efforts to boost private sector involvement?
No, what does private sector want? Private sector wants opportunity. Private sector wants certainty. And I think we need to go to the drawing table, back to the drawing table in terms of how exactly we are setting up the playing field for business here in Malaysia. I think this is a beautiful country, huge natural resources, well geographically located, etc. So there's every reason Malaysia should do very well. So the issue, I think, is that we need to relook at the system as a whole, how our businesses are allowed to, do their thing, how entrepreneurship can be let loose,
right?
How talent can be attracted, both Malaysians coming home as well as foreign talent into our economy, because the future isn't about big companies. The future is about young entrepreneurial businesses,
right?
And that's what we need to grow in this country.
Okay, Dr. Sri, hold that thought. We've just got to go for a very short break. So in the meantime, let us know your thoughts on the discussion so far on Twitter, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, and you're still with us on Money Matters as we speak with Dato Sri Nazir Tun Razak. Can we talk about the tax very recently, which initiatives? So, in the bid to generate additional revenue, the prosperity tax is to be introduced in 2022. But there's also been a lot of discussion on whether or not the GST should be reintroduced. So, in terms of the best approach to strike the balance between implementing tax reforms and at the same time not erode business sentiment, what do you think would be the right approach?
I mean, firstly, I think not enough people pay tax, and our government revenues need to be higher. You know, we're going to go through this period where debt levels are elevated, and it cannot last for too long. That's very clear. So the decision the government has to make is where these additional tax revenues will come from this year, next year, and onwards. And I firstly, you know, I think that it was a mistake to have wiped out GST. I think GST should be reduced rather than wiped out, because when we are to reintroduce it, and we eventually will have to, it will be a very painful process to reintroduce that system, right? Secondly, I think the government is correct to have introduced a form of a windfall tax. I might argue that a prosperity tax may be less fair than a targeted windfall tax, but that's a difference of opinion.
Right.
The point is there needed to be a windfall tax to add to the government's revenues. And I think going forwards, we need to think about our whole tax framework, its fairness, but also, you know, how we can increase tax collection whilst not undermining entrepreneurship and general business enthusiasm.
Right.
So here, you know, one needs to think about the balance between income and wealth tax. Quite possibly, I would argue that, you know, there's room to increase wealth tax without needing to increase income tax.
Right, got it. Now, in your book, you've mentioned that the economic growth in the country is expected to slow in the next decade. So with stiff competition within the region, how do you think Malaysia can bring in quality investment? Because this seems to be the buzzword always when they say that we're looking for investors to come in, quality investment, and subsequently positioning Malaysia as an investment hub in the region.
Well, I think we just have to, you know, make ourselves more attractive to business and to investors. And I just don't think this is something that can be left to the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Trade. I think it needs to be a more holistic view about what it takes to get Malaysia competitive again. Yeah, and this is where, in my book, I go on to talk about this idea of another national consultative council to really look at the system as a whole. You know, how the economy is governed, the linkages between business and politics, the role of government-linked companies, etc. I think there needs to be a holistic review.
So now, let's talk about the Asian economic growth. So ASEAN is already a firm engine of the Asian economic growth, the world's third fastest growing economy after China and India. So being an advocate of ASEAN economic integration, so how do you think member nations can tap the opportunities that lie ahead, and what challenges do you think they can face, especially now, post-pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, let's just be reminded that in 2007, ASEAN talked about this ASEAN economic community, single production base, free movement of people, capital, and so on and so forth. And they promised to do that in 2015. In 2016, they announced the ASEAN Economic Community, but didn't do anything like what was promised. Yeah, and you know, companies like CIMB, Maybank, and all that, we prepared ourselves for the AEC. It never arrived. But the prospect for a more integrated regional economy remains very exciting.
Right.
So what's the gap? I think, to me, the gap is that the ASEAN, the economic project is too top-down. You've seen it in many respects, like the banking framework, for instance. It was put together by central bankers, but actually it should be put together by banks. And if you look at it, the document talks about giving licenses for banking in different countries. Well, that's not what we need. We need things like back office outsourcing, free movement of staff, and free movement of information. That's what banks need. So that's an example of why business, the private sector, needs to be more involved in the ASEAN integration plans.
Right. Okay, that is, we just hold that thought. We've just got to go for another short break. Do stay tuned for more on the discussion, and remember to share your thoughts with us on Twitter, so don't go anywhere. Thank you for staying with us on Money Matters. We're talking to Datuk Sri Nazir Tun Razak regarding this book, What's in a Name. Now, Datuk Sri, why did you decide to release this book at this period?
Because I'd finished it. It took me a long time. I started writing in earnest in June 2019, and it took about 2 years to put it all together. I didn't wait for any specific event. It was ready. I published it.
Okay, but again, the inspiration for writing the book, you must have had some serious thoughts of doing it before deciding to do the book.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think, I've always thought it was unfortunate my late father didn't get to write a book. It's a very important medium for us to share with future generations our lessons, our good decisions, our bad decisions. And I think more and more people should write their memoirs for other people to learn from. And I tried very hard to write my story, to be as honest as I can, but at the same time, I wanted it to be very readable. And I hope I've succeeded so that, I contribute to the discourse about what it takes for this to be a better country going forward.
Right. Now, of course, one of the interesting points in the book was basically your role in CIMB, in making CIMB where they were today. But of course, now you've been appointed as non-executive chairman for Bank Pembangunan. But everyone sees you as being very synonymous with CIMB. So why the decision to go back into banking, so to speak?
No, I was asked to go to Bank Pembangunan as a sort of stint of national service. One. Two is it was very clear that the government wanted to build a stronger and more effective development finance institution out of Bank Pembangunan. So they've got this plan to merge a few DFIs together, and they wanted me to kind of oversee that.
Right.
And of course, thirdly, you know, it's personal. This was an institution set up by my late father, so it was kind of made it a bit more difficult to turn it down.
Of course, talking about your late father, I mean, the legacy and identity that you have, you know, I mean, you are Nazir Razak, the former Prime Minister's son. You're also Nazir Razak, the former Prime Minister's brother. And of course, Nazir Razak, the prominent banker, you know. Again, having said that, they say, you know, anak Prime Minister and things like that as well. So how do you feel when you're referred to in this way?
Well, there are three different ways. I prefer the third one, where it's just about me. But then again, you know, the book is very much about this name that we all inherit. You know, we all have a name. I mean, you know, I bet when your daughter has a girlfriend, has a boyfriend, you'll say, you know, anak siapa,
yes.
Right? It's a very natural way of getting to know people. And I've always said, you know, my problem has been that I've never, in Malaysia, I never give anyone first impressions. I can only give second impressions, because they've made up their first impressions by, you know, who my brother was, who my brother is, or who my father was, right?
So now, again, talking about the book and your father, you mentioned the book of legacy of values, principles, and methods as well, which basically your father had instilled in terms of good values, whatever. So have you taken that, you think, and put the right message out in the book for the younger generation to read?
Yeah, I think it's very important that people get that point, which I was trying to make, that in the end of the day, what is most important about the Tun Razak legacy, and I thought I thought a lot about this, is his values, principles and methods, and not so much the institutions, the policies that he put in place, because those were relevant for the 1970s. They may or may not be relevant today. So we shouldn't, you know, defend or try and protect the new economic policy or, you know, FELDA or whatever if it's no longer relevant. I think he was a very methodical person. He made decisions based on evidence, and I think he'd be the first one today to say, you know, you must review all these things that I did for 1970s to see whether it's still relevant for today. It's still relevant for the future of the fourth industrial revolution. In your book, you've also said that we need to recalibrate our nationhood and get back to the path of being truly Malaysians. So can you explain that a little bit more? Well,
have we deviated away so much from that path?
I mean, I think that I was just talking to Tun Musa, who served under my father those days, and he said, you know, right from the beginning, this was always about building a Malayan nation, then a Malaysian nation. Even the new economic policy was about creating the conditions for national integration. And we need to get back on that project of building a Malaysian nation. And unfortunately, things like the new economic policy have these side effects that we need to mitigate. It does harden identity, you know, by having affirmative action, etc. And we need to do things to mitigate this. And I think in the past, there's been a lot of rhetoric, but not enough substance in terms of, you know, projects and policies to bring people together.
Right. So, final question before we go, Dato Sri. Would you consider going into politics?
No, I would not, because, you know, I think that is not me, and the way politics is conducted also doesn't excite me in any way. I think, you know, I'd like to make I'd like to contribute to public life, and, you know, I think, you know, putting forward and trying to push this idea of having another deliberative platform now is a very important project.
Right.
And if that succeeds, I can say, you know, look, no, I didn't go into politics, but I helped change politics.
Right. So, because of time, we've got one more question for you about banks. Basically, banks have been facing tough times during the pandemic in terms of dealing with the cash-strapped customers, so to speak. So, being in an industry for 29 years, what do you think will be the main challenges for the banking industry in 2022?
Well, one is their balance sheet. the NPLs, and I think the moratorium and all that has helped. But will these borrowers be able to repay and service their loans going forward? That's one. Two is, I think, there's a talent challenge because I think banking has become a much less sexy place to work. So they are now no longer top dogs when it comes to attracting talent. A lot of people are going into technology companies and private equity and so on. And I think third is the digital challenge. There are new banking licenses coming out, digital banks, and banks that don't get their digital strategy right will fall by the wayside.
Right. Dato Sri, thank you very much for appearing on Money Matters. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the program this week, and we thank Dato Sri Nazir Tun Razak for joining us on Money Matters again. To our viewers, do come back to the show next week, same day and same time for more money insights that matter. With that, I'm Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. Stay safe and see you soon.